Hi, everyone. If you're wondering, we'll start in just a moment. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Liz Hutchison, Professor of History and Associate Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at the University of New Mexico, where I am fortunate to lead and help with UNM's participation in the Action Collaborative for Preventing Sexual Harassment in Higher Education. I'm really pleased to welcome all of you to this virtual event, a discussion with the authors of the book Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, published earlier this year, which now seems like 2 decades ago, by W.W. Norton. I'd like to extend my thanks to my colleagues in the Action Collaborative, Drs. Amy Levi and Barbara Rodriguez, the Feminist Research Institute, and the Women's Resource Center for their support. Please note that should the subject matter cause you any distress, you can reach a confidential advocate during the presentations by calling the number on this screen. Leading us today in our discussion will be local screenwriter and actor Elizabeth Dwyer, who is also a UNM colleague in the NHSC Communications. Elizabeth, would you please introduce our guests?
Absolutely. I am delighted to be here. Our guests today are Jennifer Hirsch and Seamus Khan, who are both professors at Columbia University. Together, they are co-authors of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus. Their work on that book was realized as part of Columbia's Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, which was co-directed by Jennifer and clinical psychologist Claude Ann Mellons. We are delighted to welcome Jennifer and Seamus to our virtual discussion today. Liz already gave a little bit of a content warning and let you know about the confidential advocate we have available today. Just want to let everyone know before we officially begin the discussion, it is important to note that this talk will contain descriptions of actual sexual assaults as students experienced them, which can be difficult material to listen to. We know that in every room, virtual or not, there are survivors. So I wanted to give that number one more time, which is 505-277-3716. Please do take care of yourselves and know that you are not alone. Welcome, Jennifer and Seamus. I would love to give you an opportunity to say hello.
Hi, nice. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely. Let's kick things off just talking about the SHIFT study a little bit and why you decided to write Sexual Citizens.
So cast your mind back to 5 years ago. So hard to even remember last week, right? But in 2014, the national conversation about campus sexual assault was really focused on adjudication and on improving those adjudication processes. And it seems unimaginable to think that actually the federal government was in some ways leading that process, but pushed by advocates, there was a lot of attention to making those processes more victim-centered and fairer. And that is important. And there was a notion of campuses as sort of a hunting ground. In fact, there was that film, The Hunting Ground. And I've spent my whole career studying the social organization of sexual behavior. And I thought, there's like a piece of this that's missing. And that piece is prevention. And so I reached out to Claude initially, and we developed the idea for SHIFT, which Columbia funded. And the goal was that if we understand more about the social production of campus sexual assault, if we take campus assault, which for decades we've known is such a common element of undergraduate life, and we look at it as socially produced, rather than the product of of bad people, then we can unproduce it or at least reduce it. And so let me just, as an example of that, Austin in some ways was such an engaging student to interview. He told the story of, I mean, it's the only sort of steamy sex scene in the book. It's Austin and his girlfriend on a hot summer night. Not going to spoil it, just say they made their own fireworks. And, he was a committed lover. He had nicknames for the kinds of orgasms that his girlfriend had. So he seemed like a nice guy. And yet in the interview, he haltingly described what he first characterized as a weird experience. And, he was freshman year. He was sent off to sleep in a room that wasn't his room because his roommate wanted to be alone with his roommate's girlfriend. And there was a girl in that room, which was the roommate of the roommates the other girl. So there was a girl in that room, and she sort of drunkenly mumbled as he came in that she didn't want to do anything. And like that by itself is weird. Like, why should you need to explain to a pretty much stranger that like you don't want to do anything with them when they're in your bedroom? And yet he got in bed with her and he started to touch her body, and then he stopped himself. But that's an assault. And he later in the interview, when we asked him what an assault was, he said, well, it's unwanted sexual touching of any kind. And his eyes welled up, and then he was like, fuck me. Like he was really so shook to acknowledge that he had done something which he could only imagine as something that bad people do. And so in Sexual Citizens, we look at sexual assault as a form of harm that could be prevented if we did many things, which we can talk about. But so the question that I will end with is just, or at least end this answer with, is what could have kept Austin from that assault? That's what Sexual Citizens is about.
Absolutely. So I just want to mention for folks listening today, watching today, that we will have a Q&A for about 30 minutes at the end of this conversation. So if while Jennifer and Seamus are talking, you have any questions that come up, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and we will answer some of those at the end as we have time. So Jennifer and Seamus, I'm interested in the main title of the book, Sexual Citizens. What is a sexual citizen, and what concepts that you explored in your study, what did they teach you about autonomy and power as they relate to sex?
So a sexual citizen is somebody who knows that they have the right to say yes to sex and the right to say no to sex. And it's somebody who recognizes that the people that they're in intimate encounters with have those same rights. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we heard time and again from young people was either a denial of their own sexual citizenship, so a denial of their own right to say no to sex that they didn't want to have, or an ambivalence to the sexual citizenship of other people. So just being very concerned with what they wanted out of a sexual encounter and not really caring what other people wanted in sexual encounters. And so, the concept is something that we see not in the kind of classic sense of citizenship, of something that some people are born with and other people aren't born without. Instead, we think of it as something that communities cultivate and develop. And I'll give two examples that will highlight this. So one of the things that we found was that women often, not always, but often grew up in contexts where they were taught to deny their own sexual citizenship. They were taught that their own right to say yes or no to sex wasn't really something that they had. And, Gwen was a woman that we spoke to who sort of a classically beautiful woman and, a white blonde woman who kind of slipped into New York club scene really easily. Even though she wasn't 21, of course, she was sort of allowed into these places because she was the kind of young woman that, creepily or not, the club promoters, et cetera, wanted to have around. And she was excited to talk to us. She kind of had a list of things she wanted to talk to us about and experiences that she'd had. And as excited as she was, as we listened to her story, some of it was actually quite sad. It ended up being like a list of sort of, C-list actors and not so famous athletes that she'd meet at these clubs. And she ended up back in their hotel room, and she didn't want to have sex with them. And so she told us that she had a solution to this, which was to just, quote, give them a blowjob so she could get out of there. And in that story, what Jennifer and I see is two major failures of sexual citizenship. The first is of the communities that raised Gwen, where for her, it was literally easier to perform oral sex on a man than to have a conversation about the kinds of sexual encounters that she wanted. And then the second major failure of sexual citizenship was it with those men who, never asked Gwen what she wanted out of the encounter. They sort of had a deep sense of sexual entitlement, so they certainly had a sense that they had the right to say yes to sex, and in some ways like a deep sense of that. But what they didn't have was a sense of the obligation to see what it was that the person they were with wanted in that encounter. And so, in Sexual Citizens, one of the things that Jennifer and I do is we have these moments of being quite moralistic about sex, but we're not moralistic about who people are having sex with. So it's not about, are hookups bad, or, what do we think about queer encounters? We're very, very, not just open, but we embrace those sets of things. Where we are moralistic is how people treat one another. And sexual citizenship is this community fostered sense that people have the right to say yes or no to sex whenever they want, and a sense of moral obligation that we have to other people when we're in those intimate encounters.
That makes a lot of sense. And in the book, you also, Jennifer had mentioned that there are a lot of things we can talk about in terms of, what creates the kind of environment that you just mentioned. And one of them that you mentioned in the book is sex education, and how it's necessary for preventing sexual assaults. Now, I know that when I think about sex education, it's very much, it has to do with nuns teaching me nothing. So what are the kinds of ways that you learned about the importance of sex education through your study?
Many of the students, when we asked them about sex education, actually said, "Oh, you mean my sexual diseases class?" And they would, as you did, they would talk about the scary pictures that they had been shown, and all the terrible things that teachers had told them would happen to them if they had sex. And so that is an undermining of their sexual citizenship. And the book's title is really a little bit of a provocation, because our argument is that we can't really address the problem of sexual assault without acknowledging that young people have the right to sexual self-determination, all young people. And we learned a lot about sex education in the project. The bigger SHIFT project that the ethnography was a part of, there was also a survey, and also a community collaboration component. But the survey research, in a paper, in an analysis led by my husband, so I always have to give John a shout out, John Santelli, found that women who had received comprehensive sex education that included training in how to say no to sex, which is not abstinence-only sex education, it's just sex education that includes a skills development component, because we know as educators that learning involves skills development and not just receiving information. So those women, not to bury the lead, those women were half as likely to be raped. That is a really big effect size. That is as effective as the target for a COVID vaccine. That is as effective as the flu shot that we all need to get each year. Everyone, if you're listening, get your flu shot. And so we argue in Sexual Citizens that part of the way towards reducing campus sexual assault is age-appropriate, comprehensive, medically accurate sex education, which doesn't mean teaching kindergartners about penises. It means teaching kindergartners to keep their hands on their own bodies, which, like, frankly, I think every day we see another example of somebody who failed to get that memo. So that is one of the prevention arguments that we make in Sexual Citizens, is that sex ed is part of a solution. And just broadening out a little bit, we also show that sexual assault is not one thing. And so there's not going to be one solution. Sex ed is one thing that will prevent some assaults, but looking at the diversity of assaults helps us think in a more complicated way about the fact that there's not going to be any magic bullet that's going to do everything.
Right. So like the story of Austin that you mentioned earlier, the young man who realized as he was talking to you during your interview that he had committed an assault, that, you know, obviously that sex education, having those skills-based components, teaching kids, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about consent later, but teaching kids about consent from a pretty young age as part of one component of their sex education. This story, like Austin's story and other stories in the book, really highlight the needs for those conversations. And then, you know, transfers into conversations about restorative and transformative justice. And also taking into consideration like the calls to defund and abolish the police that are gaining mainstream attention. Can you speak to all of these ideas and how they overlap and how we as a society should consider shaping sexual citizenship with these, like this new set of values?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you know, sexual citizenship is partially a community development strategy. It's a strategy for how it is that we can build healthy communities. And, you know, we really can't expect people to be able to say no to sex they don't want to have if we never talk to them about sex, or to express their sexual wants and desires if all we ever do is plug up our ears and say, nah, 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 I'm not going to listen. I don't want to hear about it. I mean, those are a set of lessons that are grounded in shame and grounded in silence. And shame and silence are two things that we feel, and we found in Sexual Citizens, really lay the groundwork for sexual assault. Now, in terms of the restorative justice framework, you know, Jennifer and I, our focus in Sexual Citizens is really on prevention and not on what to do sort of after an assault happens. And it, again, as Jennifer said at the beginning, it's not that that's an unimportant question, it's just not the question that we ask. But, you know, we're inspired, I think, or I know we are in fact inspired by a lot of the racial justice work that has been done over the last 40 years, and a lot of the reflection that communities have been doing about the problems of mass incarceration. And, you know, mass incarceration was, in part, it's many things, the idea that we could punish our way out of crime, and that we should punish our way out of crime, and that the way to address problems in communities is through punishment. And the lesson that we take from in Sexual Citizens, or the lesson that we draw out, is that we're not going to punish our way out of this problem. The idea that we could punish our way out of sexual assault is in many ways a fantasy. It's a fantasy in part because of the harms that punishment can do to communities. It's a fantasy because we need to recognize that most sexual assaults are never reported. You know, in the survey that Jennifer has referred to a couple times, led by Claudine Mellons, we found that 3% of the assaults were reported to the administration of Columbia and Barnard. And so, you know, if only 3% are reported, what is punishment going to do in terms of making sure this doesn't happen? You know, I want to tell just another story of Adam, who was a queer, a gay young man who was from a conservative background. And, you know, he was really excited to come to Columbia because it was in New York City, and he felt like he was going to get away from the kind of challenge of his family and their denial of his sexuality. When he got to New York, he didn't love the city because, you know, what he thought was going to be a wonderful place, he found it to be like basically a bunch of gay men who were kind of interested in hooking up and then ghosting him. And they would pretend like they were into relationships, but they really weren't. And so Adam talked to us really, almost lovingly about his boyfriend and how glad he was to have finally found a relationship. But he also somewhat haltingly told us a story about how his boyfriend was really forceful about sex, and this created challenges. And he told us how his boyfriend came home one evening quite drunk, and in Adam's words, he basically raped me. Now, Adam didn't call this a rape. He didn't call this a sexual assault. He said he basically raped me, and he never really talked to anyone about it because the relationship was so valuable to him. We're not going to punish our way out of the kind of assaultative sex that Adam had in that relationship. He didn't want to talk to anyone about it because he didn't want his friends to not like his boyfriend, because the relationship was so important to him, because he feared sort of being back out on that New York dating market, and he really liked his boyfriend. And so we have to think about a wider range of prevention strategies within our communities that sort of seek to foster in Adam a sense of his own sexual citizenship, and most importantly, in his boyfriend, his partner, a deeper sense of his obligation to talk to Adam about what he wanted and to open up space for those kinds of conversations about the difficult encounters that we have in our intimate relationships and how we can successfully navigate them.
Yeah, so speaking of, all of the tools you're talking about providing for people, and especially starting at a younger age, that really, would empower them to have these conversations, whether with people they're starting to get to know in an intimate way or people they're already in intimate relationships with. A lot of naysayers will pop up. As I mentioned, I was raised among nuns. They'll pop up with things like, if we teach kids about sex, it will make them have more sex or have sex when they're too young to be having sex, or, it sexualizes children, or like all of these danger, fear, shame, risk factors that they mention, or that they'll argue as why we shouldn't do these things. What did you learn when you were working on Sexual Citizens about the truth of those claims?
The truth of those claims has been comprehensively refuted by generation. Like, we didn't need to answer that question because that question has resoundingly been answered. There's a important new review that's actually just coming out in the Journal of Adolescent Health this month that summarizes decades of research on the impact of sex ed. And we know without a doubt that sex ed does not make young people have sex. And we also know that it leads to many positive outcomes, not just there's an emerging body of work around sex ed as a tool to prevent campus sexual assault, but we know that it has many other positive impacts. So that wasn't a question we needed to answer because that question has been answered. I think that the argument that we make in Sexual Citizens is that sex ed needs to be part of a panorama of strategies to prevent campus sexual assault. That, people have approached campus sexual assault as a campus problem, and really it's an everyone problem. And what that means is both that, families and schools and I was fortunate to grow up in a religious tradition that does provide a more positive view of sexuality. But we've been delighted that our book is now taught in 2 Jesuit schools. So I think that even within the Catholic Church, there is apparently room for us. But so really, it's an everyone problem. And that means that every single organization that touches young people on the path to adulthood needs to be part of the solution. But it also means that once on campus, we need to think a little more expansively about who is a sexual assault prevention stakeholder. One of the dimensions of the SHIFT project that was most rewarding was our communication over the course of the project with key administrators. And so we had a sort of administrative advisory board. It was never our intention to hand a binder of recommendations to administrators, because there is a shelf in every university for binders of recommendations, right? That have like decades of binders about diversity, equity, inclusion, about sexual assault. Like that's not how institutions change, is by being told what to do. I think we all know that. And so instead, we, from the beginning, took what people in public health call a community-based participatory research approach, where we were in conversation with them, and Claude and I would be sharing what we were finding, and they would sort of reorient us towards the horizon of the possible. And as part of that ongoing back and forth, the campus vice president for housing and dining began to understand sort of what we describe in the book as sexual geographies, the ways in which space is part of the production of vulnerability. And he is the decider about how space is allocated. And so he had never seen himself as someone who had the capacity to be part of the institutional response to prevention. And so he actually changed the hours of one of the dining halls so it was open all night. So students who were drunk, when the bar is shut down at 4 o'clock, there's really nowhere to go but someone's bedroom. And in that bedroom, there are 4 pieces of furniture. There's a desk, a dresser, a desk chair, and a bed. And if you go back to someone's room at 4 in the morning and you sit at the desk chair, that's a little weird, right? Like that. So you end up sitting on the bed, and then beds have sexual meanings. And so, which is not to say don't go back and sit on someone's bed, but just that like the power that campuses can leverage is not in yakking at people. Like telling people what to do has never been our A game in public health. Our A game is transforming the environment. And so thinking about how campuses can create a different kind of sexual geography, a sexual geography that troubles with, instead of reproducing the power inequalities that exist on campus, is one of the ways that Sexual Citizens poses a new vision for prevention.
Yeah, speaking of the public health approach that you took, addressing sexual assault as a public health issue in this book resulted in one of my favorite concepts from the material, which is that we have to stop working one penis at a time. Can you tell us a little bit more, expand a little bit more on why it's so important to take a public health approach to sexual assault?
So I'll just give a shout out to Jennifer here, because that line is something that she's used in her earlier work as well. The public health approach to not just sexual assault, but any range of problems says, it's really hard to change individual behavior, but you may be able to change the contexts wherein people navigate their lives, and by changing those contexts, guide their behaviors in new ways. So, that seems kind of abstract, but let's give some examples. Public health is sort of one of the major things that it brought us was running water, right? And if you think about clean water for a moment, one of the ways that we could get clean water is to yak at everybody and teach every single individual person in the world how to clean their water, right? So we could have had a very individualistic approach to clean water and be like, it's everyone's individual responsibility to clean their own water, and they've got to make sure that their water is clean, and then we're going to make sure that we tell people how to do that, right? Imagine how difficult that is, though. And most people aren't actually going to do it. So when, Elizabeth, is the last time you thought about clean water? Probably not that recently, right? What happens? You turn on the tap, clean water flows out. And that doesn't require behavior on the part of people, right? All it requires is creating systems, water treatment facilities, monitoring, et cetera, that actually produce clean water for us. And so the public health approach sort of says, how do we create a kind of clean water approach to sexual assault? How do we transform the systems that we all live and breathe within so that we can prevent, maybe not all, but a lot of the sexual assaults from happening? So, another analogy here would be driving. And it's an analogy that we use again and again in the book. And one way to think about driving is everybody, and the sexual assault analogy here would be like, everybody needs to learn to stop at stop signs and red lights. And you're like, yes, that is absolutely true. Everyone does need to learn that. And they need to learn it in sex, and they need to learn it in driving. But if you just knew how to stop at stop signs and red lights, you probably wouldn't be the safest driver out there, right? Like there'd be a lot of things you didn't know, like, you know, how to yield and how to enter an on-ramp and all of these other things, and like what it means to go with the flow of traffic. And, you know, there are lots of other things about driving. And so we have driver's ed, right? But we don't just have driver's ed. We also have road crews that make sure that trees don't obstruct those stop signs. And we have, you know, people who plan road safety, who make sure that pedestrians are okay. We have people who paint things on the road to give us signals about warnings that we should be aware of. We have people who design cars in such a way that, like, when we do get into an accident, because accidents happen, we're not harmed that much. And so if you think about it, there's a lot of work beyond stop signs and red lights that go into safe driving. And we might want to ask ourselves, with sex ed and with sexual assault, what is the equivalent work? What is the work of transforming fundamentally the environment broadly conceived, including education, but also thinking about the environmental design and contexts that guide people to act in ways that are healthier and safer?
That brings up two other questions I want to make sure that we address. One of them has to do with current systems, the ones that we are trying to navigate without necessarily all of that help in place that you just talked about. And the other is a little bit about consent and how to start incorporating that into the education for children, for youth. But first, let's address the current systems. So you do talk a lot about the role of power in sexual assault, and you learned a lot, you were able to reveal a lot about the ways that race and sexual orientation and gender and identity and other social qualifiers can influence the likelihood of sexual assault. So within the systems that are currently in place, can you speak to how youth with marginalized identities will experience power and sexual citizenship differently?
So it was very impactful for us to look at the data and see that every single Black woman who we interviewed had experienced unwanted touching. And it doesn't mean they hadn't also experienced other forms of sexual assault, but every single one of them had an experience that signaled to them that their bodies were not deserving of respect. And so, you know, the book, certainly gender is an important form of organized social difference that produces inequalities, erasures of women's sexual citizenship. And so there are many sexual assaults that need to be understood within a gender framework. But if that's the only kind of power inequality that you are attentive to, then you miss the fundamental ways in which, you know, all of those instances of unwanted touching, you can't understand them without thinking about racism. Right. And so, and not just thinking about race, but thinking about racism. And so let's name it. So in Sexual Citizens, we take a very intersectional approach, looking at all of the different ways in which these socially organized power disparities produce opportunities for assault. But also we look at another form of power, which is sort of situational disparities. So I'll tell another story. And this is in many ways sort of like the prototypical assault that people imagine when they imagine a campus assault. So Lucy was a freshman and she had gone to boarding school and been very sheltered, and she was excited to get to campus. And like a big part of her project, her sexual project, was losing her virginity, making out with some boys, losing her virginity. And so she and her friend went to a bar early on in freshman year, again, I think the persistent mention of bars that allow underage women in as part of the context of vulnerability. But so they met two seniors at a bar, and it felt exciting to have these older men, older, higher status men, be paying attention to them. And so when Scott invited Lucy after a couple drinks back to his fraternity, she went. It felt like it was all coming together, and they stumbled up Amsterdam Avenue. They ended up, Lucy's friend Nancy was calling because she had gotten that bystander intervention and she wanted to keep an eye on her friend. So they actually waited for Nancy to catch up with them. They went into the fraternity. Fraternities are not allowed to have alcohol. Doesn't mean they don't have alcohol, it just means they keep it upstairs. And so offering the two girls drinks, Scott then ascended with them to the second floor. So like, pause to imagine the scenario. You have two women who are like 18 years old, probably, in a building they've never been in before, on a campus that they are new to, during a time of adjustment to that campus when sort of the prime directive is not to look stupid. And they're interacting with a man who is 3 years older, surrounded by his friends in a building, not just that he knows, but that he lives in, has more sexual experience, probably 40 pounds on Lucy. There are many forms of situational power inequality. So Scott invites Lucy up to his room. She exceeds because it seems like she is interested in Scott and his attention is flattering. They make out, and then he starts to take off her pants, and she says no to him. She is very clear. She says, no, don't. And he says, it's okay. And then he raped her. And it's possible. It is truly possible. We're not letting Scott off. We're not saying like what Scott did was fine. What Scott did was not fine. And in fact, pretty awful. And at the same time, it is entirely possible that he didn't understand that what he was doing was assault, that he was in that rape script where women are supposed to say no and you're supposed to just keep going because that's how sex happens, that you just like move the ball down the field. But if all you think about is what's in Scott's head, then you miss all of the other power inequalities. You miss the age difference and the sexual geography. And there's so many ways that we could intervene. Certainly, people who wield more social power need to be made aware of how that social power can lead to them harming peers without meaning to. But the broader point is that there are both socially organized power inequalities and then situational ones, and they come together in ways that make students who may not be bad people do very bad things to their peers. And by understanding that, we can begin to think about how to change that context.
Right. So the last thing I want to talk about before there are two more things. I hope we can squeeze in both of them before we open it up for Q&A. And I just want to make sure that everyone on the call knows that you're all welcome to ask questions, faculty, staff, students, who's ever on the call. Just go ahead and pop your questions into the Q&A and we will get to those shortly. So I would love to really quickly speak about the role of teaching the tool of consent. I have a daughter who's about to turn 6, and we are definitely already having these conversations. They're introduced by a little dinosaur puppet called Consentosaurus, which is really great. The dinosaur needs consent to bite your finger. But I think there are a lot of hesitancies, especially to teach very young kids about things like consent and bodies and, when it is and is not okay to, basically teaching them autonomy because we have a fear of sexualizing children or teaching them about sex too early. Can you speak to the role of families and communities in teaching kids about consent and how to say no and how to hear no?
So generally we take turns, except I get the mom questions. So I'll take the mom part of this, and I think Seamus can take the community part. So I think, my most cited article ever actually is called Sex Education and Sexual Socialization. And it makes that distinction between the school-based sex ed that young people can receive and the fundamental role of family, whether it's parents or guardians, in forming values around sexuality. So the 8 million times you say to your kid, don't grab, use your words, and not necessarily about sex, like about anything, right? Food or whatever, like that is a sexual assault prevention message. We just need to, when they're older, help them make the connection between not grabbing things and not grabbing people. So I think it's our job as parents to form humans. And so parents step up, and in particular, dads step up, because we heard a lot from young people about conversations that they had with their mothers around these topics, and very little positive interaction with dads. I know that not every family has two parents, but in families where there is a dad, that's a thing that dads could be doing a lot better. And at the same time, we know that not every family is going to be the sex ed family. Not every family is going to support the sleepover, even though there's good research that shows that, you know, when your kid is in a committed relationship in the end of high school, there is no more powerful affirmation of their sexual citizenship than to say, if your partner wants to have dinner with us, they can stay for breakfast. Like, and that is the most awkward cup of coffee you will ever make. But it's also, I think, a really, like, if you want your kid to think about intimacy and sex in the context of a committed relationship, there's no more powerful way that you can communicate that than actually letting them do it, right? So that's the family part. But then I think, you know, I'll hand off to Seamus, the community part.
Well, I think Jennifer, you hit on the community part, which is, you know, this is going to take not just parents, like it's not just another thing that parents need to do to raise kids. There's so much of this push of just kind of like, let's just push it off onto the parents, because it's also, that's really a recipe for inequality as well. It's a recipe for a context where, you know, some kids are going to grow up in fortunate circumstances where their parents have high degrees of education and, you know, literacy and the capacity to gather the information that they need about the quote unquote right way to do this education and provide it for their kids. But lots of other kids are going to be left out, you know, either because their parents don't know to ask these questions, don't know how to do this, didn't receive the education. And so, you know, I think that, you know, we've said many times, and I think, you know, we'll say it again, that having a multi-sectoral approach, thinking about the many places that can reinforce these lessons, and that we need to remind ourselves that comprehensive sexuality education is not about the mechanics of having sex. It is about the importance of your own autonomy and the importance and the moral obligation of respecting other people's autonomy. And that is what sexual citizenship is. It's this idea that we cultivate in young people, their sense that they have the right to their own autonomy, and they have a deep moral commitment to recognizing the equivalent rights in others. And what we need to do is just build a bridge between all of those lessons and sex, so that, you know, when educating your 6-year-old about this, it's not about the mechanics of sex. Sex never comes up at all. I mean, it can if you want it to, it doesn't have to. But that upon that foundation in those conversations, then other lessons are drawn later when it's an age-appropriate time to have those future conversations.
And there's just one more thing that I would add on to that, which is to think about building communities in which queer students feel seen and feel a sense of citizenship. You know, there's one story in the book of a young person who didn't come from a family where they could be out. And so a summer theater program was the first moment where they felt really seen and in community. As they said, they were gender non-binary. It was my first seeing of queerness. And it felt magical. It felt like, oh, there is a place where I belong in the world. There's a group of people who will see me. And they were assaulted in that summer theater program. And so and part of their vulnerability to that assault, I mean, the other person acted in a way that was predatory. So obviously that person has responsibility for their behavior. But for the person who was assaulted, if they had grown up in a family that supported their gender identity, or if they had gone to a school that had a GSA, a gender and sexuality alliance, if they had been in a community where their church valued who they were, like there's so many ways in which the erasure of and stigmatization of queer youth produces vulnerability. So I think thinking about state policies and laws that support LGBT youth is like a fundamental part of this vision of sexual assault prevention.
Absolutely. So we only have a few questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the last question that I had for both of you, which I think is essential to this audience in particular. So for folks on this call or watching the video after the fact who are doing this work or are interested in getting involved with this work, what strategies do you recommend that campuses and communities and advocates implement moving forward to combat campus sexual violence?
So the first thing, maybe not so satisfying to everyone, there's so much focus on the campus, but it's not that the campus is too late. It's probably never too late, but it's late to receive this. And so this kind of education, that in the survey that we've mentioned a few times before, led by Claudine Mellons, one of the findings, which is consistent with many findings with similar surveys, found that one of the strongest predictors of being assaulted in college for women was being assaulted in high school. And, we need to get to people earlier. And so one of the first things I would say that the communities can do, especially among the student activists, and Jennifer and I love our student activists, like they were included in our community advisory board and, brought so much that was valuable to our conversation. They can think about the power that they have within their state legislators and the voice that they can bring to conversations about what they missed in high school and earlier, and what the consequences of that have been for them. There are real consequences for educating people in ignorance and shame. And and for the administrators on campus, if young people were showing up to campus unable to add, presumably the university would say something. They would be like, kids are coming here and they can't add, and they should be able to add. This is a failure of the education system up until this point. And so the first thing I would say is put pressure on state legislatures. It does not have to be federal policy. In fact, federal policy is probably not going to be super effective, in the years and decades to come, to get the kinds of things that you want to see. The second thing I'll say, and Jennifer, I think will probably build off this, is build a big tent. Sexual assault prevention fundamentally requires a commitment to equality. Jennifer said before, every single Black woman that we spoke to told us a story of unwanted sexualized touching. That is not just an issue of gender, it is an issue of gender and race. And so there needs to be broad-based coalitions between different activist communities throughout campus, from those engaged in racial justice, those engaged in class justice, those who are addressing issues of ability on campus, and the LGBTQ community broadly conceived. All of them have a role to play, because equality is a sexual assault prevention strategy. And so thinking about how to create equality on campus, how to create campus policies that produce equality rather than augment inequality, is something that all of us have to do.
And as I would add two things onto that. The first is from a student services point of view. There have been sort of 4 siloed areas of operation that are all actually intertwined. So there's people doing sexual assault prevention. There's people doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. There's people doing mental health work. And then there's people doing substance abuse prevention. And like the all of those topics are intertwined and they're all related to the production of campus sexual assault. And so I think the idea is not to like add on more work for people who are already overworked and underpaid, but to create structures that will reward their collaboration and enable their collaboration, as opposed to giving them metrics of success, millions and millions of served, just like, let's give this seminar to that many people. So I think enabling those people who are doing prevention work to collaborate is really important. And then the biggest lever of power that campuses have is their allocation of space. I mean, whether it's with faculty or students, I have seen colleagues cry about the offices they were assigned, right? So like space is power on campus. And we're frequently asked about, what is the future of fraternities and what is their role in sexual assault? And I think that that's actually the wrong part of the space question, because what universities can do is they can allocate space in a way that undermines those power inequalities. So make sure that first-year students and other minoritized students, whether it's queer students or students of color or women, make sure that those students have spaces where they can host parties, not just affinity group spaces where they can host meetings. Those are important too, but make sure that they have spaces where they can host parties, and then think about housing. I mean, now it's, I don't know if UNM is on campus, but, many students are not. And we have to remember that, for the college experience in America, most students are in community college and don't ever leave home. But for students who do leave home, there's been this naturalization of the idea that as you get older, you get better space. And what that does is it funnels younger, more vulnerable students into spaces controlled by older students. So that is a sexual assault opportunity structure, right? Like that produces vulnerability to sexual assault, and administrators could think about better housing for first-year students that would enable them to have private spaces for sex if they want, and spaces where they could host parties, where their parties are maybe not so policed, even if they're under the drinking age. So those are some concrete suggestions that we have in terms of what can be done on campus. And I don't think campuses should have to be in the position of providing remedial sex ed. I think that particularly at public universities, call the State Board of Regents and be like, prepare these kids.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So there are a couple of questions in our Q&A that directly relate to what we're talking about right now. And the first one is about the research and how it translates into more real world experience. So you have a lot of clarity in your research, but how can we get the value of sex ed across to people in power who will ultimately shut it down? So they reference sexual awareness weeks or sex awareness weeks, and how those types of activities at universities have led to defunding and firings instigated by state legislatures or regents. So is it therefore as much as an electoral as an educational question?
I mean, there is very clear bipartisan support among parents for sex ed. And so if we have elected officials who treat it like the third rail, we need to either educate them about this widespread bipartisan support for which there is good empirical evidence, or we need to get new elected officials. We're lucky for the moment to live in a democracy where the people who hold elected office are accountable to us. It is very easy to get a meeting with a state legislator. And so educating them about the connection between sex education and campus sexual assault, we think is a great strategy, because there's not at the state level, I think, a big pro-assault coalition. And so helping legislators see that this is a moment where for bipartisan progress, like we all want kids to be safe. So I think framing, like connecting sex education to the energy around Me Too is a great strategy to move this forward.
Absolutely. So you had mentioned at the state level, you don't think that there's a lot of focus pro assault. I know there's been a lot of concern about the on campuses around the adjustments recently made to Title IX. And one of our other questions does relate to that in terms of both prevention and reaction seeming important when addressing campus sexual assault. Can you speak to any examples of universities that are using a restorative justice model in their work with survivors and perpetrators versus a punitive model?
This isn't totally what we've ended up, our focus has almost exclusively been on prevention to shift the conversation, but there are places that are looking into restorative justice models. And for those listeners who don't know what a restorative justice model is, it is a victim-centered approach that focuses on acknowledging the harm that's done and then finding ways towards resolution of that harm. And so one of the fundamental features of the restorative justice approach is the acknowledgement of harm. And the American legal system is not designed for this. So the American legal system is designed with a very different logic. The logic is that people vehemently argue for their position, and then a neutral body using reason evaluates what is reasonably the most likely outcome. And so, it's actually a system that by design is oppositional. And so it's not that like you happen to get opposition in the legal proceedings, it's literally how we've designed the system. And so, that is likely to create a lot of harms, especially in instances of sexual violence, but in many other instances. One of the things that was the most surprising to Jennifer and I when we were doing this research, Jennifer and me when we were doing this research, was that many people, when they either were assaulted or committed an assault, described what they were doing as having sex. And it just spoke to the kind of profound ignorance about what sex was. We tell one story in the book. It's entitled "I Put on a Tie, So I Knew I Was Going to Have Sex," and it was a young man who'd been invited to a formal by a woman, and he didn't really like her, but she was from a really high status sorority organization, and he was in the middle. He was an athlete and was in the middle of season, and his season wasn't going particularly well. And so he didn't drink at this event. He went with her because she liked him and because she was high status. And so he knew that this would be good for him and good for his friends to be part of this sort of high status exchange. She proceeded to get very drunk that evening, pretty profoundly drunk. And, at the end of the night, he could not find a way to sort of get her to her room and get him to his room. And so they ended up in his room together. And he described to us, in his words, having sex with her as she went in and out of consciousness. And he described this story to us, which we account for, we describe it as a rape in the book. But he described to us this situation as being the aggrieved party. That is, he was fulfilling his obligation to her because she'd asked him out and because he'd put on a tie. Like he thought of himself as sort of like satisfying his obligation in this gift exchange kind of system, which is an anthropological concept. But if we think about that for a moment, like an oppositional adjudication system is not the way to address that context. What is a pretty major education of that young man about how what he did could be experienced by other people, how it constituted an assault, how that might make him someone who did something pretty bad. Doesn't necessarily make him a terrible human being, but it was certainly something he shouldn't have done, and he likely committed an act that had considerable harm.
And so he needed to reflect upon that. And so what Jennifer and I are suggesting is that a successful prevention strategy leaves space for that kind of thing. Or if we recall with Adam and his boyfriend who came home and was drunk and, quote unquote, basically raped him, that leaves space for Adam to have the kind of control over his own experience with that and space for his boyfriend to learn. And so that's what we're sort of calling for. A little bit more specifically, actually, Skidmore College has done some work on restorative justice, and they have discussions of what that looks like and how it's worked out for them. So if you're kind of looking, that would be one of the places that you'd certainly want to check out as part of a restorative justice model for sexual assault adjudication.
Fantastic. That was very helpful. Speaking of the two stories that you mentioned involving drinking, there are a lot of examples in your book that do include drinking and drunken sex as as part of the experiences that people have. So can you talk about how your study does or does not lead to transforming the environment around drinking?
Well, I hope it leads to transforming the environment. I mean, I think first naming the environment, which we describe as the toxic campus brew, but the practice of heavy campus drinking, we came to understand as a practice of white masculine privilege. That it used to be that on these campuses, higher education was actually reserved for wealthy white men. And as the campuses have become more diverse, the sort of cultural imaginary around what college is like or how to do college hasn't necessarily shifted. So I remember before my own older son went to college, I was like, oh, it'd be fun to have a family film festival of movies about college. And then they all turned out to be movies about binge drinking, right? Like Animal House. When you rewatch it, it is awful. And not just Animal House, but Porky's, et cetera, on and on. So many movies about heavy drinking as like a fundamental part of the campus experience. Even that movie where like it's a mom who goes back to school, right? It's about her heavy drinking. Like she does, a beer bong. And so I think that naming it as a practice of whiteness and masculine privilege leads to thinking, okay, how can both to the recognition that not everybody is seeking that experience. And in fact, we found that about half of the assaults on campus, in the survey, were not related to alcohol. So I think that we need to remember that a prevention strategy needs to encompass addressing intoxicated assault, but it also needs to address non-intoxicated assaults, which are more likely to be in the context of a relationship. And it also needs to acknowledge that there's a connection between the sexual shame that we produce as a society and heavy drinking. There are some students who they don't just happen to drink and then have sex. They, in fact, like intentionally drink and have sex because they think those two things go together like chocolate and peanut butter, like that it is a fun thing to do. And that is part of the social organization of sex. And then there are other students. I mean, there's one young woman, her words haunt us, where she described getting drunk before hooking up as like Novocaine before going to the dentist. So like, she wasn't born with that shame. That shame was socially produced, right? And so if we did better at teaching, in particular, young women, that their bodies were not shameful and that sex is not a bad thing, that whole like thing with the tissue paper, that, the purity ritual that abstinence only sex education does, that shows young women that like after they have sex, they're like a damaged piece of wrapping paper or a piece of tape that's not sticky anymore. Like there are very powerful messages that young people get in America, and young women in particular, about how sex is bad. And those messages have a real consequence in terms of producing shame, which drives heavy drinking, which then is part of the vulnerability to campus sexual assault. So that wasn't an answer that was about the solutions, but I think that understanding the complexity of the landscape is the first step towards thinking about how to re-engineer it.
Absolutely. So what ideas, and this is another question from our chat that somewhat ties in with where you were heading a little bit. What ideas do you have for communicating the message that sex education isn't just about STIs and pregnancy prevention, but broadening to include a lot of the things, tools and conversations that we've talked about here?
So, almost nobody that we spoke to, in fact, nobody that we spoke to told us the following story. When I was young, my community and my family told me that sex was going to be a really important part of my life, that it was going to be one of the ways that I connected with other people who were really valuable to me, and that I need to think about what I want out of that part of my life. And that, to me, and I think to Jennifer as well, it's a failure of the clarity that communities can provide in developing a sense of young people's sexual projects, which is something we haven't talked about as much in this conversation. But another concept in the book is sexual projects, an answer to the question, what is sex for? And that we need to understand why we're having sex. And it may seem like only the kind of question a group of academics could ask because it's so obvious, but actually the answer is not so obvious. It's not clear always what sex is for. It's sometimes for pleasure, it's sometimes for connection, it's sometimes for status, it's sometimes to have children, it's sometimes for a new kind of experience, it's sometimes to accrue skill. And, there are lots of reasons why we have sex. And, I think that one of the ways that we could think about having and advancing these conversations is by saying that actually, this is a way that we connect with people. This is something that we're really going to value. And if it's going to be something we really value and something that we use as a way to connect to some of the people who are the most valuable to us, we need greater clarity about what we want from that. We need greater clarity about who we want to be as sexual people. And so part of it is like, yes, it's an awkward conversation, but it doesn't have to be an awkward conversation. It can be a conversation about values. It can be a conversation about recognizing the fundamental humanity of other people. And, there's this sense that any talk about sex is somehow sex promotion, or like it fundamentally is something that we're doing that is amoral. Well, no, actually, we're trying to flip the script on that a little bit and saying it's actually something that you can do and should do that is fundamentally a moral thing to do, to provide space for conversations where people can talk about this very valuable thing to them, and to try and develop clarity and a voice. For the people who are interacting with young people today, like, how can you expect them to have a voice around their sexual desire if the only thing you promote is silence? Is it any surprise that in their sexual encounters, then they are silent or they are unable to express what they want? They have to practice it. And so this, to me, is one way to sort of open up the space for conversations about why sex ed is so important. And I'll say one last thing here. There's this sense that like young people today are sex crazed and like we have this like broad sexual amorality. But, research time and again shows that like young people today are having less sex than their parents, and they are not having sex at younger ages than their parents first did. And so like, it is like number of sexual partners is declining, age at first sex may be going up slightly. Like, we are not in a national context of sex that is really any different than the parents of current college age students. And so we need to be real about that, and real about and more empathetic around the practical lived experiences of today's college students. And Sexual Citizens, in trying to pull back the curtain on college, really is a way to try and do that.
And just one thing that I would add on, I'm doing a lot of adding on today, but is just to give a shout out to our friends at SIECUS, the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the US, who recently changed their name. So now their name is SIECUS Sex Ed for Social Change. And so I think that it really is a reframing of sex ed as part of social justice work, as part of racial justice work, as thinking about it's not a technological project, but as Seamus was saying, a values creation project where the values is not the value of sex, it's the value of other human beings.
Mhm. Well, I don't really know how to top that. So we're just really good. So it sounds like a great place to wrap up our conversation. I do want to note there was a comment that popped up in our Q&A, and I just kind of want to posit it for the folks who are listening and watching, that one of our other viewers provided in terms of talking about the profound differences about what sex is, and really just kind of adds on to this idea of the generational similarities. They mentioned the 1970s consciousness raising groups, small groups that talk about their intimate relationships, sharing stories about consent, orgasm, power relationships, saying no, the sexual projects that you guys mentioned, body autonomy, all of these conversations. And our participant mentioned that these groups are something that could maybe be organized by women's centers or other campus groups who are interested in this subject matter. So I just kind of wanted to posit that for the group as one thing that you could do if you feel like I'm not in any of these advocacy groups that were mentioned earlier, but something that you could do just as an individual if you're interested in cultivating the kind of sexual citizenship that we discussed here today. I wanted to thank you both, Jennifer and Seamus, for being here with us. This has been a really wonderful and illuminating conversation. For anyone who is listening who has not read Sexual Citizens, it's available now in hardcover and audiobooks, wherever books are sold. And the paperback edition will be coming out in January of 2021. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah,
Great.
pre-order paperback.
Pre-order the paperback. Who doesn't love a good paperback? Well, thank you so very much for being here again, Jennifer and Seamus. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much for lifting up our work and leading us through this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Everyone have a great day and stay safe out there.
Bye.
Bye.